as the number of white settlers from the east increased dramatically, conflicts with the native tribes did so as well. The Transcontinental Railroad had become the catalyst for much of this new conflict. Before its completion, the only Americans to venture westward had done so on horseback or on Conestoga wagons, but the railroads meant that thousands could migrate much more quickly, cheaply, and comfortably, which would give white Americans a numerical advantage over Native Americans. And the wars generally always revolved around land. Native Americans fought desperately to live on their ancestral lands, as white Americans strove to claim it for their own. In 1877, Congress had passed the Dawes Act, which changed the way Native American reservations were allotted. Instead of land held by the tribe in general, it would be allotted to individual families, with the goal being to abolish the tribal way of life and to allow native land to eventually be sold into white hands. In many cases, the size of reservations were significantly reduced, and the balance of land was then offered to white settlers. Despite numerous treaties, the demand for native lands meant that the U.S. government would void old treaties in order to make new favorable ones for white Americans. Native Americans were growing increasingly intolerant of being pushed onto less desirable territory and seeing their lands repeatedly reduced. And this often meant conflict. Sand Creek was a village of approximately 800 Cheyenne Indians in southeast Colorado. Despite the territory having been promised to the Cheyenne by an 1851 treaty, on the morning of November 29, 1864, a group called the Colorado Volunteers surrounded Sand Creek, attacking and killing about 400 people, most of whom were women and children. The brutality was extreme, with some Cheyenne being shot while trying to escape, while others were killed, pleading for mercy. Reports indicated that the troops even emptied their rifles on distant infants for sport. Later, Colonel Chivington, who had been the commander of these troops, displayed his scalp collection to the public as kind of a badge of pride. But when word spread to other Indian communities, they agreed that the whites must be met with force. Most instrumental in the retaliation were Sioux troops under the leadership of Red Cloud. In 1866, Sioux warriors ambushed troops that were trying to complete the construction of the Bozeman Trail up in Montana. Of the 81 soldiers and settlers that were attacked, there was not a single survivor. Faced, though, with a stalemate, Red Cloud and the United States government agreed to the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which would bring a temporary end to the hostilities. In that treaty, large tracts of land were reaffirmed as Sioux and Cheyenne territory by the U.S. government. But the peace was short-lived. In 1874, a scientific exploration group led by General George Armstrong Custer discovered gold in the heart of the Black Hills of South Dakota. When word of the discovery leaked, nothing could stop the large numbers of prospectors looking for gold, despite the treaty protections that had awarded that land to the Sioux. Chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the local Indian leaders, decided to take up arms to defend their dwindling land. Custer was under orders to locate the Sioux encampment in the Bighorn Mountains of Montana and trap them until reinforcements could arrive. Though he didn't entirely follow orders. On June 25, 1876, he discovered what he thought was a small Indian village on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. He confidently ordered his troops to attack, not realizing that he was actually confronting the main Sioux and Cheyenne encampment. About 3,000 Sioux warriors, led by Crazy Horse, descended on Custer's regiment, which numbered only a couple of hundred men. and within hours the entire 7th Cavalry, as well as George Custer himself, were massacred. A single horse being the only survivor. The victory was brief, though, for the Sioux. The rest of the United States Army arrived and chased the Sioux for the next several months. By October, much of the resistance had ended. Chief Crazy Horse had surrendered, but Sitting Bull and a small band of warriors had escaped to Canada. The crackdown on Native Americans, though, did not end with the pursuance of Custer's attackers. Any tribes resisting American advancement were relentlessly hunted by settlers and federal troops. A year after Custer's defeat, the Nez Perce Indians of Idaho fell victim to westward expansion. When gold was discovered on their lands in 1877, demands were made to reduce their reservation by 90%. After a standoff between tribal warriors and the U.S. Army, a group of the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, fled towards Canada to avoid capture. He had hoped to join forces with Sitting Bull and then plan a move against the United States government from there. But Army officials chased the Nez Perce some 1,200 or 1,300 miles across Idaho and western Montana. As the Nez Perce neared the Canadian border, not realizing they were as close as they were, they paused to rest, having covered that roughly 1,200 or 1,300 miles in just over 3 months, as winter was setting in the upper Rocky Mountains. But the United States Army closed in on them, and Chief Joseph was forced to surrender. The entire tribe was then relocated to Kansas and Oklahoma, where nearly half of them perished from disease and despair. Their stock, in particular the herds of horses that they had come to rely on and had made their near escape possible, were mostly slaughtered. The armed resistance was largely over. The remaining Sioux would be forced onto reservation, essentially at gunpoint. Many, though, sought spiritual guidance as to what to do, and thus began a religious awakening amongst the tribes of North America, particularly the Sioux. Instead of bringing the answer to their prayers, however, this ghost dance movement would result in yet another human travesty. Followers of this religious awakening amongst the Native Americans believed that an Indian Messiah would come and free the world of the white man. They would be able to return to their lands, and the buffalo would once again roam the Great Plains. Followers of this belief meditated, had visions, chanted, and performed what was called the ghost dance by the United States Army. Soon the movement began to spread, and before long this ghost dance had adherents in tribes throughout the South and the West, far beyond the Sioux. Although the movement preached nonviolence, many whites feared that this was the beginning of a great Indian rebellion. And to them, ghost dance followers seemed to be more defiant than other Native Americans. The rituals seemed to work its participants into a frenzy to the eyes of the army. This was quite disconcerting to the settlers and the soldiers throughout the South and the West. Tragedy struck, though, when this ghost dance movement reached the Lakota Sioux. Local residents of South Dakota demanded that the Sioux stop this ritual. But when they were ignored, they called in the army for assistance. Fearing aggression, a group of 300 Sioux left their reservation. Army regulars believed that this was a hostile force preparing to attack. And when the two sides came into contact, the Sioux agreed to be transported to Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the Army demanded the surrender of all their weapons. Amid the tension, a shot rang out. The 7th Cavalry, which had been reconstructed since it was lost under George Armstrong Custer, then opened fire on the Sioux. The local chief, known as Chief Bigfoot, was shot in cold blood as he recuperated from pneumonia in his tent. Others were cut down as they tried to run away. When the smoke cleared, almost all of the 300 men, women, and children were dead. Some had died instantly. Others were left to freeze to death in the snow. This massacre marked the final showdown between Native Americans and the United States Army. And 1890 also represents the point in history when the United States Census Bureau declared that the western frontier was officially closed.